Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about German tanks. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about the size of them, the armaments on them, or even the thickness of the armour, for example. However, I'm going to talk to you about tanks in relation to training in the Home Guard. Now, I've mentioned in previous videos about the Home Guard, initially set up in May 1940 as the Local Defence Volunteers, and then under Winston Churchill, the name changed to the Home Guard. And it's interesting because in the early days, their main role would have been observing and reporting, which is one of the reasons why they used to say Local Defence Volunteers, or the LDV, stood for Look, Duck, and Vanish. However, when they become the Home Guard and they started wearing a proper uniform and they started being given a whole host of weaponry, really, to be fair, their focus was now to fight the German invader. And what you have to remember is people often used to say they were the pitchfork army. However, that was really in the first few hours of the formation back in May 1940 of the original Local Defence Volunteers. However, by the time they were uniformed, by the time they had the name Home Guard, there were actually specific Home Guard weaponry, as well as older or more outdated weaponry like the Lee Enfield, for example, in the P14 and P17. Anyway, we're going to concentrate on tanks, as I said, and the focus was fighting off the invader. And because the British government had seen how the Germans made use of the tank, especially in what we now call the Blitzkrieg, where they went through France, Belgium, and so on, the focus of a lot of Home Guard training was to deal with the tank, deal with the Nazi tank, deal with the Nazi invader. So you do find a lot of illustrations in Home Guard booklets, even posters, showing, for example, different forms of tank. And what you have to remember is some of the early tanks in the early days of what we call Blitzkrieg, the tanks were relatively small. I always say they're slightly larger than, for example, a 4x4 that people drive to supermarkets and that with in Struggle to Park, for example. So we're talking relatively small tanks. These are not the big tanks that you see late in the war, 1944, 1945. Not talking about King Tigers, for example. We're talking relatively small scale tanks. And the Home Guard, they did actually have a battle school. That was at Osterley Park, which is actually owned by the National Trust today. And that was eventually shut down because there was a big fear that most of the veterans from the Spanish Civil War and a few communists as well were doing the training. And the British government got a bit nervous with the fact that all these Home Guard, all these civilians were going there and being trained in guerrilla warfare. So we also get illustrations like these that would have been used in the manuals of the day. This has been taken from a manual, and this is what they were all taught. Obviously taught that the tanks would be rolling forward, possibly with Stuka dive bombers bombing ahead and artillery. And what you have to remember, we had seen this in 1940, we had seen this in 1939 and slightly earlier as well, before the Second World War began, with the Blitzkrieg going on. It was a typical German tactic, something actually that they started to develop right at the end of the First World War. But you always have to be aware that as well as having tanks rolling forward with all the support of air power and artillery, you have to be aware that the infantry's job would be to fight alongside the tanks and flush out the infantry who are probably waiting to blow up these tanks. And like I said, there was a lot of training focusing on these tanks and the infantry that support them. And I will also draw your attention to this little leaflet, instruction leaflet number 8, that came out in 1940. And as it says on here, tanks and tank destruction. Now, I will do another video at a later date where I will show you how you ambush a tank. And trust me, I will be taking the information straight from this book. But that's a story for another day, shall we say. Now, the first thing that the Home Guard were taught was not to be scared of a tank. Now, you would think a tank is a scary thing, a solid lump of iron, people hiding inside it, it's got a gun on it, it's got machine guns on it, and it's travelling at a relatively fast speed. Well, actually, the Home Guard was told, don't be scared of it, because at the end of the day, the tank is a vulnerable thing. And it's quite odd, but the closer you are to a tank, the safer it is. In other words, if you stand at a distance and a tank gun will see you, it will fire at you, and it will constantly fire at you until you're annihilated. Whereas if you get nice and close, and some people say even if you manage to sneak onto the back of the tank and sat there, they wouldn't know you're there. And you have to remember the gun can only depress to a certain angle. So if you're below the gun, it won't be able to shoot at you. So Home Guardsmen were told to get close to the tank. Get close to the tank and it is much safer, believe it or not. But the Home Guard were also taught the vulnerable points of a tank. And you see endless amounts of illustrations like this. And like I said, this was taught to the Home Guard. Remember, the local defence volunteers were initially to report on enemy invasion. By the time we get the Home Guard, by the time Winston Churchill renames the LDV as Home Guard, they're really talking about stopping the invader. And that's really important to remember, because everyone sees Dad's Army, for example, everyone thinks of the Pitchfork Army. They were actually very well trained, and like I said earlier, they were very well armed. They had specific Home Guard weaponry as well. Now for this, I am going to show my little wooden model of a tank. Now I've painted it black purely because if you look at what the Observer Corps used during the war, they often just had black silhouettes and it was used for training purposes. So what I've done is painted this little wooden tank, very early tank, a small scale tank. And I've also painted red parts on it. So we've got red at the top there, red at the sides, and we've also got a red underside. And the reason why I've done this is when we portray Home Guard, we are often asked by people like English Heritage to pretend we're at a battle school. And when the public come along, we imagine that the public, every single one from the oldest person there to the children sat at the front, we imagine them as Home Guard soldiers and we're training them up. So we often use things like this to demonstrate with. So I always say to people, don't get scared of a tank, get in close. The closer you are, the safer it is. And what you will notice is the red areas are actually corresponding with what would technically be the vulnerable points on a tank. And if you think back to the image I showed you earlier, there were arrows pointing at certain parts of the tank which are vulnerable. In other words, they are weaker, they may be easily damaged, for example. These are classified as vulnerable points. So starting at the top, and we'll work our way down. So this little box here, and there's also one on the side, they're actually hatches. In other words, they're entry points and exit points for the crew. Now, because it's an opening, it's a weak point. So you want to get them to open it. You want them to open it up so you can get in. But remember, even if it's locked down, it is still an opening at the end of the day. So it can be forced or broken open. Like I said, I will do a separate video on how we destroy tanks at a later date. So I'm not going to spoil it. We're just talking about the tanks and the vulnerability of them. You will also notice there's some very thin little slots painted red around it. Well, they're actually what's called vision slits, and they're the equivalent of something like a letterbox. So these are the only way the tank crew can see the outside world. So if they haven't got their hatches open and they're sticking their head out, which they won't be in combat, they have to look through these tiny little letterboxes. And like I said, if you can get on the back of a tank somewhere where there is not a vision slit, they probably won't know you're there. You have to be very quiet, however. So these vision slits, because they are, once again, an opening, they are vulnerable points. So as you can see, I've painted them red like the rest of the vulnerable points. Then as we move down, I have painted the turret, the round bottom of the turret. And that's because it was said one of the most vulnerable points of the tank was the gap between the turret and the hull. So we've painted a red band around there. Like I said, I will go into a bit more detail of how you attack these vulnerable points at a later date. But then we've also got these two tubes that people often think, oh, is this some sort of German torpedo? It's not. These are actually the exhausts, and they are vulnerable. It's the same with a car today. If you damage an exhaust or you block up an exhaust, it will cause a problem. So these are vulnerable points, hence why we have also painted them red. At the back, you will also notice these two red boxes here. They're not lights or indicators or anything like that. These are often referred to as louverers, in other words, vents basically, and you can damage a tank by damaging those. Like I said, I will come into a bit more detail on how you damage a tank at a later date. And then when we come around to the side, you will notice I have painted these circles red, and that's because they are the wheels. And it sounds odd, tanks do have wheels, and they're guide wheels really. It's what the track runs around, and if you can cause one to break, fall off, or even get buckled in some way, it will either slow or stop the tank dead in its tracks, as I say, really. So the wheels are vulnerable on a tank, but like I said, they do have wheels. Now, what runs around the what runs around the wheels are the tracks. So I've marked these on also in red, and they are probably one of the most vulnerable bits of a tank. If you can get the tank track to come off, the crew will have to get out to actually deal with it, and they will have replacement tracks, but it takes a very long time to change the track on a tank. So if you can get them to fall off, get them damaged in a way, the crew will get out. And remember, the crew are vulnerable. Not only is the tracks the most vulnerable thing, obviously the most vulnerable of vulnerable is the crew. When they're outside, they haven't got armor on, they're dressed exactly the same as the home guard. I've also painted the bottom of the tank, and this is a well-known story that the base of a lot of tanks are weaker than the tops of the tank, because remember, tank design is relating to people attacking it from above, the back and the sides, whereas the bottom is often not as strong. Now that's not the case on all tanks, because obviously there is such a thing as a landmine, so there are some strengtheners at the base of the tank, but generally speaking, especially in the home guard world, they were told if you can get a tank to go up on, for example, an obstacle, the base is open to attack. It's vulnerable like that, really. So hopefully this has been a little bit of an introduction of how the home guard were taught how to deal with the tank. But like I said, at the moment, this is almost like lesson 1. There we have a German tank, no bigger than, really slightly bigger than a 4x4 of today, and the red bits are the vulnerable points. Now in another video we will talk about attacking the German tank. How can you damage those red bits? How can you damage the vulnerable points of the tank and technically wipe them out? The best thing is we never had to do it. The Germans never ever invaded. But the interesting thing is a lot of these theories about tank attacking and so on was actually created in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. So it's quite important that even though we're talking about it and it didn't happen, in Spain these techniques worked. So we know that if there was tanks in Britain in 1940 invading, war, driving down our street in Worcester, then we would know how to deal with them. Anyway, on that note, enjoy. Make sure you've taken notes about this. You never know when you need to stop a tank, and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.